thinking, I'm not sure that this is normal, but certainly it's new. And so we're going to look at some of the experience that we have seen over the past 9 or 10 months, and then more specifically into some strategies that I think are very quick and easy that organizations can implement in order to support employees and ensure that you're driving forward the best outcomes possible for everybody. Quickly, mental health is not a bad word. In fact, having mental health is actually a good thing. And so, it's important to put that in context in terms of what we're talking about. This is a definition from the World Health Organization. I think the point of this is really to say that there is not only a mental health disorder aspect, so things like depression, anxiety, but also things that more relate to mental wellness, which is non-diagnosed things like stress, productivity, relationships, and all of that sort of thing. So there are a few types of quote unquote mental health problems. These most commonly link to more on the diagnosis spectrum of mental illness. So things like anxiety and depression being the most prevalent, but certainly you can get into what would be described as disorders, mood disorders, personality disorders, substance use disorders, those sorts of things. Again, the point being that this is only one facet of mental health. It is the thing that we most often talk about in organizations because it's the thing that tends to drive the things that as managers we worry about, which is absenteeism, disability, and productivity. But again, those can be contributed through a whole host of different challenges. On the continuum of mental health, we look at mental wellness. So on an individual basis, things that can impact that are support, self-esteem, age, resilience, environment, physical health. Those are all things that contribute overall to mental wellness, versus mental illness factors can be triggered by environmental, genetic, and any other maybe challenges that you have. In terms of organization impacts on mental wellness, those are use of skills, physical demands, and then on the illness side is really around behavior-driven factors like abuse, aggressiveness. Certainly there is a nature-nurture challenge in terms of mental illness, whether there is demands placed on it that contribute or whether it's there already. I think that there's lots of research that says that both contribute to mental illness. So shifting gears a little bit, this is getting more away from the definitions and more into some of our experience during the past 9 months and through the pandemic. I want to orient you to the slide here. So on the left-hand side, there is on the one axis, there is mood and recovery, and on the other axis, there's really around time. So this is looking at how a individual or community responds to a disaster, which the pandemic falls neatly into that definition in terms of disaster. And so if you think back in the on the time continuum, pre-disaster would have been in the January, maybe early February stage, where there may have been some grumblings of the pandemic, but there wasn't really widespread understanding of what its potential impact would be. It seemed to be very regional or localized. And then if you move through that first dip was really through the beginning of March, end of February, beginning of March, when we started to see some cases land here and land here in Canada, and certainly increasing cases around the world. Definitely individuals' moods declined, lots of fear, lots of anxiety. And then we crossed over into a positive mindset through early March, what would be described using this theory as the heroic phase. So if you remember back, and again, timelines aren't exactly specific because different parts of the country are responding in different ways. It's purely illustrative. But if you remember back during those early days, there was a lot of focus, and continues to be, but a lot of focus on frontline workers, how they were rising to the occasion. There's lots of great evidence and stories and pictures and videos of frontline healthcare workers in New York and places like that where COVID was massively impacting in those early days. And so you just remember that moment of heroism that was occurring. And then we sort of peaked out at what's described as community cohesion. So this is where the community comes together. We start as a community organizing ourselves. We start behaving well. We're wearing masks. We're social distancing. We're doing all those things. We're basically coming together as a community. And again, this is in that early spring timeframe. And then what happens is, through the disillusionment phase, which arguably we're still in or maybe back in, where things just don't seem to be getting any better. We're just not having a great experience. There's sort of no end in sight. And so that was certainly through that early part of the spring into the summertime. And then arguably in the summertime, there was a bit of a recovery phase where things seemed to be improved. Case counts were declining in many parts of the world, and certainly here locally. And so there was a sense of a light at the end of the tunnel. And then I think what's happened come the fall, September, October, and now we're into a repeat of disillusionment. So whether there's a bounce back and then a further dip, if you imagine this line continuing, or whether we just slid back down the curve to disillusionment, I think that's the phase that we're in right now, with some glimpses into recovery as, great news and great stories yesterday and last week coming of the first immunizations and things like that. But just to give you a sense of this, mirrors not only the experience, but also imagine placing your own personal mood through this cycle of the year. And in many cases, it would likely mimic this in terms of your experiences. Just quickly, because a lot of what we're talking about specifically around the pandemic is really anxiety, which is a disorder characterized by a state of excessive uneasiness and apprehension. And if you imagine that much of anxiety can stem with loss of control or not understanding, what's going to happen next and all those sorts of things, that's been a large driver of certainly the experience of increase in mental unwellness over the last 9 or so months, and is driving a lot of what you're reading in the media and what you're maybe experiencing yourself and maybe amongst your employees and team members is, that there is definitely an increase in anxiety around what is happening. We're an EAP company, so I'm going to talk specifically about our experience that we've seen over the past 9 or 10 months as an EAP provider. Obviously, largely of what we do as a company is support individuals with whatever mental health supports that they may need. And so if you look at the slide here on the left-hand side in January, the two chevrons really factor into the blue chevron, meaning case-related calls, and the shaded, moving from white to a lighter blue, into total call volume. And so in January, basically case-related calls match up with total call volume. Fast forward to the beginning of March, when really in the country here, it was the most impactful time from a COVID perspective. Companies were closing, the government stepped in with CERB and other resources and other programs. What we saw was actually a decrease in the amount of case calls, so that are calls that resulted in some sort of a service, but a significant increase at a tune of about 30% of call volume increases. And so the obvious question is, well, what's going on there? So what's happening in that instance, specifically with us, and we've seen this in the industry, is in those early days, a lot of call volume was driven around questions people had around finances, about access to programs, about how do I get attached to CERB, what kind of financial resources are available to me, things that generally are not in scope of an EAP program or even other health benefits programs, but are still top of mind for individuals in terms of the information that they needed. And so what we saw was this significant increase at that time frame. And so the obvious question is, well, thank you, EFAP is Employee Family Assistance Program. Sorry, using acronyms. Thanks, Kimberly. The obvious question is, well, what happened with cases? You just talked about increasing anxiety. You talked about this sort of disillusionment phase. Why weren't people taking advantage of services if anxiety was running high? So it's a great question, and one that there isn't a scientific answer for, but only what we can best hypothesize as what was happening. If you imagine back in March, the thing that was impacting individuals the most was really around financial wellness. How am I going to pay my bills if my restaurant's closed, or if my spouse is out of work, or whatever that may be? And by and large, both the federal government and provincial governments responded in kind to those concerns. And in fact, in retrospect, I think have been criticized, whether fairly or unfairly, that's up to you to decide, but on how easy they made it to obtain CERB payments and things like that. At the same time, if you were struggling to make ends meet and all of a sudden you had an increasing income through CERB and nowhere to spend it, things calm themselves down a little bit. Also, what was happening during that time frame is most of the provincial governments and certainly the federal government were introducing different mental health, mental wellness resources for individuals, whether that was service lines, access to free supports. It looked differently depending on where in the country you looked at, but needless to say, there was lots of programs and lots of resources that were made available to individuals. I think the most, the last complicating factor at that time frame was, if you imagine where you may have a need for counseling support, which by and large makes up most of why somebody's accessing an employee assistance program, it becomes very difficult in that moment where your kids are maybe with you if you have kids 24/7. There's no longer a break of them going to school. Your spouse may be working at home. You may be working at home. It's hard to carve out time and space to have a very sensitive conversation from a counseling perspective. And so what we saw during that time frame was lots of questions around, how do I gain access when the time is right? How do I do this? How do I set things up? So fast forward to bullet point number 3, in the latter part of the spring, early part of summer, and call volumes still remain very high, though the case volume as proportion as part of those calls really increased fairly dramatically over the prior period. So that is, things are dragging on. If you go back to the slide a few moments ago, we're in this sort of disillusionment phase. And so it's starting to take a toll on people, and people are starting to need those help. If you remember in the media, there was lots of information about, back in June, there was a couple of studies that were released saying that relationship failure was at an all-time high during that time frame. And so, layer that on to the kinds of things that typically an employee assistance program would help with, and certainly we've seen an increase in calls in that time frame. By July, most of those basic information calls moved away, and things transitioned more into, service calls were resulting in service. And then fast forward into September, and so what we've seen in this sort of secondary phase is a fairly significant increase in the number of people that are seeking out help. So about 30% of our call volumes, and that's adjusted for any kind of growth that we've had over the last little while, are 30% increase during the past couple of months. That mirrors very well with what we're seeing, I think, in what's happening with the pandemic, where there's this secondary phase. If summertime was this time for people to catch their breaths, It's now into more periods of uncertainty. There's lots of challenges, I think, that are happening associated with that, lots of anxiety and things. And so certainly we're seeing that response. What does it look like beyond December into the new year? Are things going to continue running this high? Is it going to increase? I don't have a crystal ball to say. All as I can imagine is that until we get a great handle on some really solid concrete answers of, when we're going to be able to be safe, when life is going to, return to whatever that new normal looks like, I imagine that we're going to continue to have individuals who are seeking out support for the kinds of things that we're talking about here today on the call. So for many individuals that are returning to work after the holidays, anxiety is going to be running high for many reasons. There may still be uncertainty. There's still unanswered questions. Stuff is happening. And so I think as a good measure, we just need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of these potential concerns and issues. Be mindful that stress is multifaceted. So stress at work, which we'll talk about in a few moments, but you also have stress in the family. Maybe a spouse or loved one is out of work. Maybe a spouse or loved one is unwell. Maybe there are relationship challenges because people have changed, or now you don't have that freedom to do sort of me time, hobbies and things like that. And then I think lastly, there's financial stress that I think we have to imagine, which not only is realized financial stress of those individuals that may be out of work or on reduced incomes or on layoffs or whatever that may be, but also the threat of financial harm due to just this uncertainty and when are things going to change and what does that mean to me and all of those sorts of things. So be aware of that stuff. If we get to a point where people are returning to work, and I'm assuming that most of the organizations on the call today are by and large working remotely, I imagine that there are some quote unquote necessary workplaces and things like that where you still have people coming in, but by and large, individuals may be at home and maybe in isolation. If you imagine that returning to work where there are now people sitting very close in proximity to you, or when you're commuting to work now in close proximity, not to mention just this whole notion of creating this safe barriers amongst our colleagues and amongst the community, that can be a tremendously overwhelming for people. And that can manifest itself in lots of different ways, including behavior, including anxiety, including physical manifestation where you have shortness of breath and different sort of quote unquote panic and anxiety related concerns. And then I think the thing that we need to consider, whether this is in the new normal of returning to work or just now, is we are immensely distracted as workers. For some of your colleagues, for some of your employees, not only are they expected to complete their work, they're also expected to be teachers or to be supportive of their kids that may be getting education at home or under new circumstances. There's the compounding factor of just family dynamics that you need to appreciate, that if everyone is at home and trying to compete work, that it isn't always as easy to get things done. And so just to be aware of that, and we'll talk about some strategies of how's the best approach of dealing with those sorts of things. In terms of supporting individuals through the transition back to whatever that new normal is, and again, some of this is preemptive because we are not exactly in that time frame, but when we started conceiving this, it looked like we may be going that way. This isn't business as usual. It may not be for some time. We need to, as leaders, whether you're in a formal leadership position or informal, we need to have empathy for our colleagues and coworkers. We need to have some understanding of the fact that they're going to be dealing through lots of these things. productivity is changing. On the one hand, if people are working from home, they're probably working more hours than they ever used to because their commute is gone and it's easy to jump online and start doing work and things like that. But it's also challenging because of all of the distractions that we identified before. It's challenging because individuals' mindsets and mental wellness may not be entirely focused as it was previously. And so we need to, realign our expectations around what productivity might look like. And to a certain extent, we're into a position where we are in moments of overwhelmingness around decision making. We have to make decisions about the safety of our family. We have to decide whether our kids are going to go to school or stay home, whether we're going to go get groceries at a given time. There is significantly greater consequences to our decisions. And because of that, to a certain extent, many of your workers, many of your leaders have decision fatigue. And so you need to help them with that. Give them clear direction, outline clear expectations around what needs to be prioritized, what's important. Be prescriptive, but at the same time, be empathetic around that. People will latch on to the fact that you're making decisions, and that will be seen in a positive light, provided that you manage it in a positive way. In terms of some strategies, on the left-hand side is really around the employee experience. So that is, we have to accept life as new normal. We have to accept that, we have lineups now, that things take more time. We have to be conscious of, new expectations of us. We also have to establish new routines, whether you're working at home or whether you're working in an office tower. There are going to be changes in the way that we do things, certainly in the near term and more possibly in the medium term. So things like riding an elevator, how do we manage that accordingly? How do we manage our schedule to ensure that we're on time? Like, these are very basic things that as organizations, we have to take some leadership and really establish for our employees and really communicate that there is this new need for routines. Or conversely, if individuals are working at home, setting them up for success, establishing that there is a start and a stop time to their workday. Be really concrete about that. People need that, that break away from work, and it's very easy if you're working at home to be responding to things at all hours. I think the biggest challenge is, and certainly one that we saw as an organization, and one that was really challenging to work through, is connecting with colleagues. Listen, at the end of it, we spend a lot of our days at work, a lot of time at work, and we establish personal relationships with our colleagues and coworkers. Some of them become friends or friend-like, and it's really important to maintain those connections. That's challenging when we're faced with things like technology. We have things like Zoom fatigue, but Zoom is a good measure, but doesn't necessarily replace that connection. And so it's really important to try to facilitate with your employees that they continue those connections. And then lastly, workplace supports that you may have available. So those are things like employee family assistance programs, internet-based cognitive behavior therapy, or regular cognitive behavior therapy. These are programs that are set up. Other resources that you may have access through your benefits programs, like counseling support, things that may be available through different aspects of your organization programs that you've set up, making employees really aware of those. For you as managers, the single biggest thing that you can do is communicate. Communicate clearly, communicate often, and communicate using lots of different means, not just email, not just Zoom. Pick up the phone, have conversations, have candor, and share some of what's going on with you. The idea of clarity over compliance, what do I mean by that? So that is making sure that we're crystal clear and that we're clear in terms of what we're delivering, rather than just saying, did you do it or didn't you do it? Giving some flexibility for individuals, being clear about outcomes rather than just process. Role modeling behavior, I think that's absolutely critical, and clear direction prioritization we've talked about before. Things that you can do, and this is exceptionally challenging in a remote workforce, but you need to, as managers and even as colleagues, try this. So that is creating opportunities for connection, asking questions. How are you doing? How are you feeling about things? How are you enjoying things now versus, you know, how is it, what are you feeling? What's the success like of working at home? By asking questions, you can get to some of the underlying concerns that your employees may be having, and then obviously address it. Express concern, and the biggest issue in communication, and this is a critical component, is really listening, trying to understand, trying to have a sense of what people are dealing with, and really listen and really hear about the things that you're telling you, both overtly and subvertly. Wherever is needed, encourage help. That can be formal help in situations where the person needs support because of stress or you know, maybe worse than stress. And so that is identifying resources that you as an organization have available to you and making sure that the employee knows about those. Or encouraging help from colleagues if somebody's struggling with a task, you know, ensuring that they are not afraid to reach out and engage in support. And then the really big important one, which is sort of management speak, but which is circling back. So after introducing, you know, strategies or support to that employee or to group of employees, ensuring that you follow up with them to say, is it working? Did you take advantage of? How did you find it? And listening for cues so that you can adjust accordingly. So as an organization, the key to managing through this is really prioritization. Health and safety of your employees and your clients, whoever they may be, must come first. So that is being safe. Some of these are dictated by health and safety protocols that are coming out from provincial governments or local health authorities. Our suggestion is always to do more and not less. So overreach as much as you can in terms of that health and safety. And then really the business needs to follow. So if the idea is in the past, well, we only do face-to-face meetings, it's the only way to be effective, that might not meet the health and safety guidelines. Those should come first. And so you need to adjust around that. Adjust accordingly. So flexible work, wherever possible. These are going to be expectations of us as organizations in the future. Stopping and starting and making accommodations for school and the fact that maybe we don't want our kids going on buses and things like that. We need to be flexible around that work. We also need to be flexible about travel changes. So if your organization was one that many of your workers commuted to, using bus or transit or subway or trains, your employees may not feel comfortable using those methods, and so they may choose to drive in. That may impact them from a timing perspective. They may ask for different starts and stop times. And so try to adjust as best you can within whatever constraints that you have to really factor that in. And be aware that productivity will decline. Your effective employees, if they were making or delivering X amount of services or X amount of things in the past, they probably will end up doing less as normal as previously have done, because of all the factors that we talked about before, where there is family challenges, financial challenges, there's more stress. There's just this idea of decision fatigue and things like that. And so as a result, we are going to see, and we as an organization have definitely seen productivity decline, and we just have to accept that that is the case. We may have to identify more resources to get at what we're trying to solve, or be flexible around deliverables. We talked about support. You know, I can't say this enough. We don't always understand what is happening with our employees in their personal lives, how they're dealing with things, how it's impacting them. Try to, I think it's Dale Carnegie, I think is in the wise words of Dale Carnegie, is try to put on their glasses for a day, see what it's like, try to imagine what they're dealing with and the things, and that can in and of itself adjust our behavior in terms of how we communicate and respond to individuals. And lastly, access any resources that you have available to you, benefits programs that you may have, resources that both organizationally as well as your benefits providers may have, things like employee family assistance programs, and education. So education like this, there's a ton of education that's happening today. One of the benefits of virtual is, it's easy to jump on a Zoom call these days, and while we're eating lunch or things like that, take advantage of some education opportunities that may have a real impact in the way that you're supporting your employees in your organization. This is a big one. Self-care is massively important in terms of trying to maintain and improve our mental wellness. Healthy eating, it's a really challenging thing for many individuals to not, go for fast items while they're either working on the run or working at home and competing priorities and things like that. Trying to encourage healthy eating. If you have access to nutritionists and things like that for your employees, great thing is to run a session that can really guide them through some of that stuff. Much of it is absolutely common sense for sure, but we all need reminders and some help. Exercise is a critical thing. It's one thing that is immensely challenging for individuals right now. In most parts of the province and in most parts of the country, gyms are closed, or certainly much more difficult to gain access to. And so we need to encourage individuals to exercise, whether that's going outside for some fresh air and walks, which again is really challenging this time of year where the weather isn't always cooperative. That's a critical function. Sleep. This is a sleep. There's tons of studies that are out over the last number of years that say that sleep is the single biggest thing that you can do to improve your health. That's both physical as well as mental health. If you imagine stress, healthy eating, all those things impact sleep, but there are lots of different sleep strategies that people can encourage. The last one is challenging because there's nowhere to go. But at the same point, you need to encourage your employees, encourage yourself to take vacation and take time away. That is true time away from the laptop, from the work. There is this feeling, certainly amongst our workforce, of individuals that are quote unquote saving up time for when the time is right. You have to try to balance that with encouraging people to take time, not only for the financial liability as an organization, but also just for their mental wellness, for their physical wellness. It's important that people take some time away and take time for themselves, to whatever that may look like. Lastly, before we jump into some questions and answers, is just remember this. We're on this continuum. In any given day, you can move up and down the slide from thriving to stress to disorder to crisis. That can be event driven. If you imagine something bad happens, that can put us in a moment of crisis, but it can also be gradual, where it's this collective effect of stress that moves into periods of disorder, which ultimately, if left unhinged, move into crisis. The thing that we need to do as individuals and as organizations is focus on keeping people well, focus on trying as best we can to de-stress, eliminate stress, to move people more into the mental wellness side of things rather than into the mental illness side of things. There are interventions that can help along the way. The point is, we don't want to actually get there. We want to have people in moments of being well and thriving and things like that. And that's the end. I'm going to turn that off and go to questions and answers.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie, for that really informative presentation. we had a couple questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if you have any information on, you've come across a lot of research in your work. How does aging contribute to mental health wellness? That's the first question.
So aging has a factor for a whole number of reasons. One is, generally speaking, physical health declines, at least in part, no matter what we try to do, and that can contribute to increased response to stress and different things like that. Secondly, is there's a ton of information and evidence that supports that as we age, our mental wellness can suffer. Not saying it will, just saying it can.
Mm-hmm.
So those are factors that we certainly want to be aware of. It's just one factor to be aware of, that depending on your age, you may have a different approach to dealing with things, and certainly that can impact mental health response.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, I believe, is referring to your first slide. What factors will define the profile of this recovery curve?
So it's a great question, and the important thing is that slide was really built off of some models that exist around disaster and disaster recovery. And so there can be a significant amount of things that can impact recovery. I think more specifically to pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about recovery, we're obviously talking about the ability to return to some semblance of normal in a safe fashion, where we're not overwhelming health resources and not impacting people being sick and unwell. I think ultimately that it looks like, at least to the extent that we understand this illness, and I don't want to purport to be an expert in this, but immunization looks to be a key. I think certainly preventative health measures, will there be treatments down the road? It looks like those are all going to be factors in speeding through this recovery. And I think at the same time, things that we need to do as individuals, things around taking protective precautions, not going out and socializing and making some of those hard choices, I think will speed up the recovery phases that we're going to see. I mean, it's interesting, we saw through the summertime this sort of pseudo recovery where case counts by and large declined. If you think back to the spring, for us, I think most of us are in Ontario, we effectively had a lockdown that was lasting for a period of almost 60 days, maybe even a little bit longer, depending on how you're defining that lockdown. And so because of that, we by and large did things from a protective standpoint that really started to look like eradication. I think when we started lapsing that, when we started introducing schools and all those things, not to be critical, that's just an observation, I think we saw, an increase. And so we have to balance, and I think politicians and public health officials are really struggling with that balance of economy and the right thing to do to sort of protect against some of the health. Anyways, I'm going a bit off.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate you answering the question. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any more new questions, but I do believe I'm going to pass the mic over to Karen now, who wants to give a few messages now that she's connected.
Thanks, Kimberly. Sorry, I didn't catch you on the front end, Jamie. My audio was giving me issues, but technology is great when it works. Thank you, Jamie, so much for that information. It certainly is topical and very relevant. I've already sat through a similar webinar that Jamie did for us last week, and I learned something new every time. Thank you again, Jamie, for your time and the resources that you've shared with us today. If anyone's interested in the Employee Assistance Program that OASIS offers, we're starting to partner with Humanicare as of January 1st of next year. We have a very competitive employee assistance plan rate, and it is available on a standalone basis. So if you're looking for something for even your part-time folks that maybe aren't part of your traditional benefits plan, we can certainly help you with that. So, and if you have any questions around the presentation, certainly get in touch with Kimberly at OCSA, and I'm sure she can connect you to Jamie. So Jamie, thank you again. Thank you everybody for participating today. We appreciate your time, and hope you go about the rest of your day successfully.
Thank you, everyone. And for any questions that came in a little bit late, we will try to, we'll send them to the presenter and try to get back to you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This was our last webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. And, you know, happy holidays to everyone. Have a safe holiday and take care of yourself. Thank you. Bye-bye.